This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Susan.
And I'm Heather.
And we're in the book of 2 Samuel.
Welcome to the club. Last episode was chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, and David is all settled in. He's comfortable. He wants the same for God. His desire is to build God a house, but instead, God tells David that he will build a house for him. Maybe not in the traditional sense that we all think of a house, but as in a dynasty, the house of David, from which Jesus will eventually come. We reviewed the 5 covenants in the Bible, all of which are relational and interconnected. That was a Bible bender for me. Those include the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the New Covenant. Each covenant builds God's plan to redeem humanity and restore them to a right relationship with Him as it was in the beginning. We discussed the Davidic covenant in detail, where God promised David 4 things: a house or a lineage that will become his dynasty, a kingdom, people ruled by his house, the throne, David's son will be the king to rule, and forever. This is the promise to David that will be eternal.
All right, here's our setup for this episode. We are talking about David, and we have to remember that David is a man of action. So much so that one gets the impression that he thrives in motion and cannot be still. Think about it. From herding sheep and delivering food to his brothers on the front lines as a boy, to hiding in caves to escape Saul, and protecting the Philistines for pay while secretly sabotaging Israel's enemies. The man is clever and he makes good use of his time. But all that is over. David is king. He does not have to do it all. He has people who have people. Yet David has been told by God that he can't build a house for God because too much blood is on his hands. So what is this man of action supposed to do? Well, it's unsurprising that while looking for something he can do for God, God leads him to do something that everyone else has failed to do: secure the promised land. David must go back to war. In chapter 8, David takes action to build the nation God had planned for Israel. Now, David's already united Israel, but now he's going to greatly expand its boundaries. Scene 1, David delivers defeat.
2 Samuel chapter 8. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Mephibosheth from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. When he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River, David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons on the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went.
Okay, so to summarize this, David cleared out the promised land and created an empire. He defeated the Philistines, who inhabited the southwest coastal plains. He defeated the Moabites, who inhabited the Transjordan in the east. He defeated the Arameans in the north, and yet to come, he will defeat the Edomites in the south. David has now taken over rule of the north, south, east, and west, all 4 corners of the promised land. Now, the key verse in this passage is, "The Lord gave David victory wherever he went." David is doing what Saul could not. David is doing what God called him to do. This is his calling. This is his purpose. Not building the temple. It's taking back the promised land. David's secret to success was really no secret at all. It came down to 2 things: his heart and his humility. David had a heart for the Lord that made him obedient to God's will. unlike Saul, remember, who just didn't do it all the way. He kind of did it halfway. And David was humble. He saw all of his achievements as God's achievements. He didn't see them as his own. Unlike Saul, David's devotion to God was never crippled by his pride. Now, in the next episode, David is to take an unwise break from his calling, which has clearly been to go to war. And that's going to lead to a dark path, but his heart and humility will save his relationship with God. David will repent, something Saul failed to do. Scene 2, David dedicates the plunder.
Verse 7, David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tau, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tau. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites and the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahihud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Paliathites, and David's sons were priests.
Okay, so before you trip over that last verse, David's sons were priests, note that most of the commentaries say this is more appropriately translated chief rulers. David's sons were chief rulers, because for those of you who've been with us through Exodus and Leviticus, you know that priests had to be from the tribe of
Levi.
That's right. And David is from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, his sons could not be religious priests. All right, the summary of David's unification of Israel, his conquest of the Promised Land, and dedication of the spoils of war is complete. Note, David even took care of that Amalek. Remember Amalek? Amalek was the failing of Saul. Saul did not execute the king of Amalek as God had ordered, and it was for that one failure that Saul lost the kingship to David. So again, our author is just checking off the boxes here about what this king is doing. David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. This was what a king should be like. David was the right king in answer to Saul, the wrong king. David is the example for all future kings and the standard by which they will be judged. And that is why we read for the second time that the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. War was his calling. Winning battles was what God created David for. Scene 3. But what else is there for David to do? David has marched through all God has ordered. Did he miss anything? Surely there must be something he left undone. This high energy, overachieving man accustomed to constant pressure must have been reviewing an old list in search of anything he missed, and he found one. What about that old promise to Jonathan? The promise David made way back in 1 Samuel 20.
Then Jonathan said to David, I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, will I not send a word to let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you, as he has been with my father. father, but show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord call David's enemies to count. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself.
So the relationship between Jonathan and David was very unusual. And that's why the promise to Jonathan was also unusual, because during this period, the family of a conquered king was usually put to death for fear that they would gain supporters and try to take the crown back. But David is different. And at the height of his reign, he chose to honor his friend and the former heir to the throne, Jonathan, to show kindness. A good leader is kind. Not just kind as we know it, but a greater kind of kindness. The Hebrew word used here is hesed, which we've talked about. It's an act performed for a person in real and desperate need in the context of a deep and enduring commitment between the parties concerned. Jonathan's son is in deep need. And David, because of his commitment to Jonathan, is going to keep it. He is about to offer hesed to a person in need, just as Christ offered hesed to us. Chapter 9.
Now back to our story in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where David will fulfill that promise to Jonathan. David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodebar. So King David had him brought from Lodebar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth! At your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him.
Mephibosheth was afraid, and David saw it on his face. And the poor man had a very good reason to fear David. Mephibosheth was lame because of David. When he was young, his grandfather Saul and Jonathan were killed. Now, assuming David would come after Saul's descendants and kill them, Mephibosheth's nurse grabbed him and ran in fear. Unfortunately, in their haste, Mephibosheth fell, and his injury crippled him for the rest of his life. So this crippling moment in his life is kind of attributed to David, and he's afraid that maybe he's going to kill him. Listen to 2 Samuel 4:4, where this happened.
Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth.
So Mephibosheth has probably been living in fear, constant fear, for probably 2 decades, wondering when is David, and he's actually living in somebody else's house, wondering when is David going to, come after me? Or if David finds out, is he going to kill me?
Continuing in verse 7, don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore you to all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever the Lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet.
So this poor guy, Mephibosheth, his name means one who scatters shame. And he lives in Lo-debar, which means nothing. So it's no wonder that Mephibosheth describes himself as a dead dog because he scatters shame and lives in nothing. It's so sad. But the king sees him, and David's heart is to save him and raise him from his shame and life of nothing. So David gives 2 gifts of Hesed to Mephibosheth. He restores to him all the property in Saul's estate. Saul was his grandfather. And he gives Mephibosheth the status of son of the king. He could eat at his table forever. He restores to him the honor that was lost to him when his father was killed, the right to eat at the king's table forever as a son to the future king. A good leader, and David is a good leader, is kind, and a good leader is generous. And David's Hesed, again, is a mirror of Christ. Christ has secured our inheritance in the eternal promised land. And Christ has secured our invitation to the king's table, always and forever. And Christ can and will raise us from nothing, just as David did for Mephibosheth. David was the example of what a king should be like. Up until this point, he has been a good example in contrast to Saul's bad example. However, this act of Hesed to Jonathan's family will starkly contrast David's treatment of another honorable family in our next episode. Okay, scene 4, the Ammonite humiliation and retaliation. Chapter 10. Here's our setup. This chapter appears to be a business as usual record of David's conquests, his wars, until you compare it to the preceding and succeeding chapters. The author is subtly revealing important shifts in David, and it didn't just happen overnight. Chapters 9 and 10 begin with the exact same phrase, in the course of time. Now, this phrase is a transition indicator from our author. The narrative will transition every time the phrase is used. So it shifts at the beginning of chapter 9 and again at the beginning of chapter 10. Now, if we compare the 2 chapters, both times the phrase precedes an act of kindness by David. In chapter 9, Mephibosheth received kindness from David. In chapter 10, we're going to read that Hanan rejects kindness from David. Now stay with me here because I'm going to get to the next shift. The phrase in the course of time will be repeated again in chapter 13, verse 1. So 13 is going to move on. So now we have a transition phrase in chapters 9, 10, and 13, which means that chapters 10, 11, and 12 are a literary unit. Are you tracking with me? 9's a unit, 10, 11, and 12 are a unit, and then 13 moves on in a new unit. Sure enough, 10 verse 1 begins with a story about the Ammonites. And then at the end of that unit, 12:31 ends with the Ammonites. So our author has so strategically laid this out for us. But I got to tell you, this is a Bible bender to me. I never saw it before. All right. What will take place in between and those chapters 10, 11, and 12 that makes these chapters a unit? What's going to take place? It will not be an act of Hesed or kindness like the 2 prior. It is the story of Bathsheba, the story of David's fall, the story when David selfishly forgot all about kindness and took what he wanted. The author is creatively putting a spotlight on David's fall by bookending it with a before and an after. So everything we've studied before is kind of this is David's life before. He was such a great king. He did it all right. He's
a man after God's own heart.
Yeah, he's the contrast to Saul. After is going to be a different story.
He's still a man after God's own heart.
He is, but there's consequences. And so before Bathsheba, David experienced victory and blessing from God. And in the overflow of his blessing, David offers hesed to others. After Bathsheba, David will experience waves of consequence to his family unleashed by his sin. And in the wake of his family's destruction, David needs hesed from God. He just is not overflowing anymore. He's faced with a lot of trouble. Okay, let's go to chapter 10, the beginning of this literary unit, 10, 11, and 12.
In the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father.
The Ammonites' territory was located just across the Jordan River, east of Jerusalem. And so they were very close by, and that proximity made it important to have a good relationship with them. Now, Nahash had been an adversary of Saul's in 1 Samuel 11, so it's assumed that he was an ally of David's because, those two were at it all the time. David assumes that Nahash's son, Hanun, will also be an ally. Now note, in this verse, the author is going to begin another subtle literary message lesson to the reader. For the first time in this 3-chapter unit, 10, 11, and 12, that begins with, in the course of time, the author uses the word send. But that word is going to be used 23 times in these 3 chapters, 10 through 12. Each time, the author is making a statement about David. The king can send because the king is powerful. The king has choices. And when the king makes a choice, it is obeyed. When obeyed, there will be consequences. Good consequences if the king's choice was good. Bad consequences if the king's choice was bad. Power can be a blessing or a curse, and a king has to be careful who he sends and what he sends them for. So in this first time, Heather read, so David sent a delegation to express his sympathy. Good thing.
Continuing in verse 2. When David's men came to the land of the Ammonite commanders said to Hanun, their lord, do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and to overthrow it? So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away.
Okay, so Hanun is also sending. He has power too. David sent an envoy to offer hesed to his former ally's son, the new king, Hanun. Hanun made the choice to scorn the king's hesed, unlike Mephibosheth, who humbly received it. An Israelite's beard was a source of pride and joy, and it is thought that it was only cut when mourning or in humiliation. And so by cutting their beards, he's sending them back in humiliation. And of course, cutting their garments off at the buttocks would have been an obvious form of humiliation.
Verse 5. When David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men, for they were greatly humiliated. The king said, stay at Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back.
David, feeling compassion for the shamed men who were only following his orders, sends a message of encouragement to them. Good use of power here. David's sending is admirable.
Verse 6, when the Ammonites realized that they had become obnoxious to David, they hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobah, as well as the king of Maacawith, 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. On hearing this, David sent Joab out with the entire army of fighting men. The Ammonites came out and drew up in battle formation at the entrance of their city gate, while the Arameans of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in an open country.
So David, again, uses his power the right way. A lot of power, actually. He sends Joab an entire army out to fight. Right move.
Verse 9, Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him. So he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. Joab said, If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to rescue you. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight." Then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. After the Arameans saw that they had been routed by Israel, they regrouped. Hadadezer had Arameans brought from beyond the Euphrates River. They went to Helam and Shabak, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. When David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought against him. But they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shabak, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore.
Both powerful kings did a lot of sending in this struggle. King David sent a sympathy delegation to the Ammonites. The Ammonite king humiliated the delegation and sent them back. King David sends messengers to intercept the humiliated men. The Ammonites sent for the Arameans to help defend them from David. King David sent Joab and the army to attack the Ammonites. Joab split the army with his brother Abishai. We know that name from the past. Abishai pursued the Ammonites, but their end won't come until the end of chapter 12. And then David gathered all of Israel and pursued and defeated the Arameans. Ultimately, David sent himself into the fray, as he should as king. Fighting, winning wars, this was David's calling. Ultimately, David prevailed and came out with another victory as the most powerful king. It appears that David is the ideal invincible king. He obeys God and fulfills his calling. He is the perfect contrast to Saul. He's the man after God's own heart. Or is he? Will he be tested? What happens when David is not fighting battles? Has too much time on his hands? Too much time to think about other loves than God. In the next episode, we will dive deep into how even David could be tempted. Because whether it's an apple in a tree or a woman in a bath, we can all wander if we have the time.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, "Welcome to the club." New episodes drop every Monday, and
Get all episodes now on Amazon Music.
as always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.